on this computer. All right. So today we are going to be discussing variables and different data types. So last class we discussed the creation of string literals in our code, and we used the print function to actually print them out, or the println function. So like this, we set up system.out.println, and then hello in double quotes with that semicolon at the end. But there are several other types of data in Java beyond just strings. Here's a list of the common data types in Java. There are two numeric types. There's int and double. Int is short for integer or whole numbers. So any number that does not have a decimal place falls into the int category. It can be positive, negative, 0, any whole number is allowed there. And then this is slightly different from how Python does it. So if you're familiar with Python, instead of using float, we're going to be using double. Double is the data type that we're using here. It stores numbers that have decimal places. And as an example, 27.3. So any number with a decimal place can be stored in a double type variable. Next, we have the two alphabetical or string values. We have string and we have char. We talked about strings last class. A string is a sequence of characters stored within our double quotes, where a char, or char, I suppose you could also call it, is a single character stored in single quotes. So that's the way that Java tells the difference between those two data types. Strings are always in double quotes, characters are always in single quotes. And you can only have one character inside the single quotes for a character, because otherwise that's more than one character. And our last data type is Boolean, which can store only true and false. Those are the only two available values for that data type. So an example data type, or an example of that data type, would be false. All of those different types of values can be printed with those with that println function. Keep in mind that the only one that needs to be in quotes is the string and character type values. If you just want to print out a number, you can just put that number inside the parentheses for your println function. And the same is true for Booleans. Do the various data types make sense? Cool. All right. So similarly to in algebra, let's talk about variables. Variables are a piece of data that has been given a name. So in algebra, we'll try to solve for x, because x has some numerical value. Unlike in algebra, in our programming, we will pretty much always know the value that is stored in our variables. You don't have to solve for any variables in programming. Another way that you could describe a variable is a named box, which can store a value. So this here box is my variable. It's got a name, and it will have some value inside of it. All variables are going to possess three qualities. Quality one is the name, and that is how the variable is going to be referenced throughout your program. It should be relevant to the information, to the data you have stored inside of the variable. So you can see here, I have my num apples value. All variables must have a type, and this is the Java data type from a few slides ago, that corresponds to the data that you have stored inside your variable. So in this example, I have my number 5 stored inside. That is of the int type. Type is essentially the color of the box. And third, you need to have an actual value stored inside the variable. So that's the number 5 in this example. I have my variable numapples storing the number 5, which is an integer. Is that all track so far? All right. So in order to be able to use a variable in your program, you must first declare it. Declaring a variable means that you're telling the world that this variable exists. You're creating the box, essentially. You're like a herald in a king's court, declaring to the king, hey, this value is here, this variable is here, it exists. So there are 2 components to a line of code where a variable is being declared that need to exist for it to work. First, you need to say what type of data the variable is going to store. So in Java, the type of the variable is assigned when the variable is created, and you can't change it down the line. And so this is going to be the color of that box. So like the type of information that can be stored in that box. And then second, we need to know what the variable is going to be named. And I'll talk about the rules for that on the next slide. But here we have just an example. My int value, numapples, is the name of my variable. Does declaring variables make sense? All right. So I have my numapples variable there. So some rules for naming variables. Rule number 1, the first character in a variable's name must be a letter, a $, or an underscore. Those are the only 3 types of values that are allowed as the first character in a variable's name. So as 3 examples, we have numapples, $numapples, or underscore numapples. Those are all okay. I cannot use, for example, 5 apples because that does not start with one of those 3 types of values. Rule number 2, the remaining variable, the remaining characters in the variable name can only contain letters, numbers, and underscores. So it can only contain from the alphabet, numbers, and the underscore symbol. So numapples 5 or num_apples are both valid under those rules, and apples exclamation point is invalid because we cannot use special characters. The only kind of special character we can use in variable names is a $, or an underscore in the middle, or a $, at the beginning. So both rules 1 and 2 are necessities in Java. You are not allowed to make a variable name that breaks those 2 rules, where rule 3 is more of a soft rule. It's there to make your code more readable, but it's not a strict requirement. So rule 3 says that your name should be in lower camel case. And so this system has, where if you have multiple words in your variable's name, the first word should be lowercase, and then all of the rest of the words should have the first letter capitalized. So in my example of lower camel case, I have 3 words: lower, camel, and case. Lower is fully lowercase, camel has a capital C, case has a capital C. So you can see where each new word starts in that name. So for example, with my numapples variable name, I could use numapples with a capital A because that's separating the word num and the word apples from each other. If I don't have anything capitalized, it just says numapples or something. I don't even know what that could say because there's no distinction between the 2 words. And if I capitalize the N, also not okay. I want to make sure that first character is a lowercase letter. But Java will not complain if you name variables outside of this rule set, number 3, but it will complain if you try to name a variable different from rules 1 and 2. Those two are strict requirements. All right, so once you have declared a variable, you are allowed to assign a value to it. Assigning a value to a variable is essentially telling the variable what you want it to remember. You're putting some value into that variable's box. And you initialize a variable, it's another vocab word, you initialize a variable by assigning it a value for the first time. So when you give a variable a value for the very first time, that is called initializing it, because you're giving it its initial value. So variables are allowed to be initialized on the same line as they were declared, but they don't have to be. And I'll show an example of that on the next slide. But first, let's talk about what assigning a value looks like. So assigning a value to a variable requires 3 components. First, you need the variable's name. Second, you need a single equal sign. Third, you need the actual value that you want to assign to that variable. So in this example, I'm declaring my int numapples. So I'm going to be assigning a value on the same line where this variable is declared. So I'm going to be initializing this variable on the same line as its declaration. So numapples equals 5. I have all 3 parts from my assignment list. I also have both the parts from my declaration list. I have my data type and my variable name. So I'm doing both at the same time here. And once again, always need that semicolon at the end. So like I said, a variable can be initialized, can be given its initial value at the same time as it's declared or later in the program. So if I say string my name equals Mr. Macmillan, that is totally valid. Or alternatively, I could say string my name and just put a semicolon. Then the variable my name exists, but it does not yet have a value until later when I say my name equals Mr. Macmillan, and then put that semicolon. One important thing to note in Java is that each variable in your program only needs to be declared one time. So if you try to declare a variable more than once, you will hit an error. So if you're assigning a value to a variable that has been declared, you don't need to rename its data type. You only need to say the data type when you're declaring the variable. In Java, once the variable has been declared, it will remember what data type it's supposed to be until your program finishes. So if you try to say the data type multiple times, you'll get this kind of error. It'll say variable first letter is already defined in your main function. So just keep in mind, you only need to put that data type one time. Just covered a bunch of stuff. Does anyone have any questions about the topics I just talked about?
Before you initialize the variable, does it have a value?
It does not have a value. And if you try to use a variable before you initialize it, you'll get an error saying, hey, you didn't initialize this variable.
Okay.
Great question. All right. So more about assigning values. A variable must be assigned a value of the same type that you stated in the declaration for that variable. So if I say my variable numapples is an integer, I cannot say that it equals the word hello, because hello is a string, not an int. So I'll get this error saying I have incompatible types because I cannot turn this string value into a number. So a good assignment would look like this. I have my int numapples equals 10. And I'm assigning a value of the same type as I declared it would be. Just something to keep in mind moving forward. All right, once you have declared a variable, you can assign it a new value however many times you want. It will only remember the most recent value that you assigned it though. So it will not remember any of the previous values that it held. It will not remember anything but that most recent value. So here I have my declaration. I have my variable temp or temperature stored in a double variable, or stored as it will store a double type of value. Right here, it does not have a value inside of it yet. So on the next line, I am initializing my variable temp with the value 92.5. I'm assigning that value, and it's temp's first time getting value, so that is its initialization. On the next line, I'm assigning the value 93.7, so now temp is storing that value. And then on the next line, I'm assigning the value 96.3. So then on this line, this is the value that temp is going to remember if I ever try to access it later in the program. It will not remember that it ever held either of those two values. It'll just completely forget that. So if you want to remember data before you change the variable, you will probably want to save it somewhere. And we'll talk more about that next class. So naming variables, just keep in mind that everything in Java, especially variable names, is case sensitive. So if I've declared a variable named have apples, like I have here, I can't access or change that variable by trying to access the variable name have apples with a capital H, because those two names are different. They're not the same name, so I cannot access this variable with that name. Just keep in mind case sensitivity. So I'll get some error that looks like this. You may have forgotten to declare this variable, or it's out of scope. And we'll talk about what it's out of scope means at a later point in time. For right now, it's just important to know that we may have forgotten to declare it because the names don't match. All right, and our last piece of discussion for the day, if you add the keyword final to the declaration of a variable, its value cannot be assigned after it has been initialized. So once you've given a final variable a value for the first time, you cannot change its value. So if I say my variable, my letter, will store a character, and it's going to be final, and I initialize it with the value h, I cannot say my letter equals x after that. So I'll get this error. You cannot assign a value to that final variable because this is its final value. Now, you don't have to initialize on the same line as the declaration. Just like any other variable, you do not have to initialize your variable's value on the same line as the declaration, but as soon as you do initialize, that will be its final value. Also important to note, you can only say that a variable will be final when you're declaring it. You can't turn a variable into a final variable after it's already been declared. You can only create a variable as final when you declare it. Any questions about what we talked about today? Cool. All right. Well, there's actually only one little there's only one coding assignment for today's work. We're doing the first half of CodeHS Module 1.3. We'll cover the second half next class. So should have time to finish the quiz, and our first integer exercise should be fairly short and simple.